this is Barrie, a city constantly evolving. At any time, a whole host of pressures challenge the intricate tapestry of city government. In this series, we will explore the priorities deemed essential for progress, even if they don't always inspire unanimous applause. Join me each week for a candid conversation with a member of our city government as we uncover the stories behind the scenes of Barrie, a city on the move. Welcome to Barrie City on the Move. I'm your host, Arif Khan, and it's my pleasure to be joining you wherever you're receiving this content, at home, online, streaming, or on cable. Thanks for joining. In this series, we take great pride and pleasure in speaking with whether it's members of government or members of operation within the city of Barrie to understand what it takes to operate, run, and plan for the future of our municipality and deliver quality of life to our residents. And today, it is my absolute pleasure to have Kelly Oakley from the city of Barrie, who is the Associate Director of Corporate Asset Management, and I got it out. Kelly, thanks so much for taking time out of your schedule to join me today.
Happy to be here.
And you lead a wonderful team, a team of people who do so much behind the scenes talking about assets management. It is the things that oftentimes we either take for granted, we don't notice, we just assume are working, and oftentimes it's those things that we kind of only take notice of if, for example, they might not work. Give me a little bit of an understanding of what is in your portfolio or part of your portfolio in terms of corporate asset management.
Sure. So I have a team of people who work on infrastructure planning, whether that be planning for growth or planning for renewal. We do the same type of work in my team for planning for the city's fleet. We establish engineering standards to which the city's infrastructure will be built. And then sort of at a higher level above all of that, we work with departments across the city that manage other assets like facilities and parks and rec centers to advance asset management initiatives in their areas as well.
That is a huge portfolio, and you covered a lot of ground there, but to pare it down, there are buildings, there's fleet, and then there's sort of what's above grade and below grade. And I don't know if I kind of covered it. There's also programming, et cetera, in there. We talked about parks and recreation facilities. But what I'm hearing about is that really it's maintaining the quality of the services and the assets that allow for those services to be delivered to the ratepayer, the taxpayer, the residents of the city, but also future planning for growth. And it's a bit of a balancing act. We've had some conversations offline. I've certainly enjoyed some of the conversations and some of the studies that your team has put forward in terms of that planning. Tell me a little bit about sort of where your time is most heavily spent, whether it is planning for the future or trying to keep up with what you've got under your portfolio.
Honestly, it's a bit of everything. You raise the issue of service, levels of service, and really that's at the core of what asset management is. We talk about assets, but assets only exist to deliver service to the community. So the sort of key concepts of asset management are delivering a level of service at an appropriate cost while also balancing risk. And we can have those discussions, whether it's looking after what we own, whether it's planning for growth and assets that don't exist yet. So really, it's a really broad perspective, as you mentioned. And again, whether it's growth or whether it's renewal, we collect a lot of data across all of those areas, and then one of the key things we do is use that data to inform decision making.
Mm-hmm. And that is a big challenge, and it's a huge responsibility that the mayor and members of council have on their plate. I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest most of the members of council and mayor don't have a background in engineering or asset management per se. However, they do have the responsibility and the obligation to ensure that the municipality continues to meet its obligations, whether they're legislative as well as plan for growth and offer the citizens a quality of life that they're expecting. So that in itself is quite a large undertaking to communicate that messaging and the importance of whether it's critical or prioritization of asset management to council. You've got that coming up in the very near future with budget season upon us right now. how is it that you in your department, and we'll get into who your department is a little bit more in just a moment, but how is it that your department is able to sort of lay out priorities for council to consider?
So I mentioned collecting data, and that's one of the big pieces. So whether it's assessing the condition of every road in the city, we hire contractors to put cameras in sewers to look for defects. Our facilities teams, our parks teams are collecting data about the condition of their assets. So really bringing all of that together. As you mentioned, it can be quite technical. And then our job as staff is to take all of that data and really consolidate it and bring it up to a level so that we can present it to council and it's manageable for them to digest.
So information is something that I'm always fascinated by. Data is something that I'm fascinated. I sometimes wonder if I have a bit of a propeller on my head, and that's okay, because if there's something that I've learned, it's how we manage things today is often based on what we learned from yesterday. And I have to imagine, certainly with the size and scope of the portfolio, with the budget dollars that we're talking about, much of what you're dealing with today has to do with what we learned about yesterday. Can you give us some examples of what you and your team have learned with how things were done? Maybe, many of our assets are in and around 60 years old, for example, below grade. And at that time, we didn't have the benefit of data. We didn't have the benefit of some of the analysis that we have today. What have we learned from yesterday that we're either realized were great ideas or that we need to do differently?
Some things are really simple. Just technology is always changing, right? So materials are changing. So we don't build water mains anymore out of cast iron or ductile iron, which are really prone to corrosion in certain soil environments. Now, there's a lot of new materials that are, plastic or sometimes reinforced concrete. So there's some simple things like that. Just sort of technology is changing. We've also, I think, learned the importance of collecting data on assets as soon as we build them. So even just understanding what we own and having a really great database of where all of the assets are and when they were built allows us to do future planning.
So, as a resident, I get up, I turn on a light, I take a shower. I expect things to work. There are things that I take for granted, and behind the scenes, though, I've had the opportunity to go through a number of the facilities, see the engineers and the technicians who are working. There is sort of 24 hours a day, 7 days a week work happening to ensure that these things that I take for granted, and I'm not looking to be virtuous when I say that. I think it's true. I get up in the morning, I expect the lights to come on. These are things that I'm not thinking about conscientiously, or consciously, I should say. In terms of planning for that, for example, the city of Barrie not so long ago was a city of about 80,000 people. It's only maybe a couple of decades ago that was the case. We're now planning for doubling where we are now by 2050 being around
300,000 people by 2051. Yeah.
That's a big number. That is a massive number. What are some of the things that you're learning about in your role, in your portfolio, that really shape the city to be a city of 80,000 people? How do we get from 80 to 300, aside from just growth? Like, aside from just expanding our boundaries, aside from just putting up new towers, how do we support that growth?
So one really important thing, I think, is to be proactive, right? It's to really keep that understanding of what we own, what do we need to do to it as we build new things. Again, what do we need to do to them, understanding what the future needs of those things are so that we can deliver service into the future. Whether it's condition assessment of existing assets or modeling to understand where we need to put new water mains, where we need to widen roads to accommodate future growth, all of those things all come together to be part of our asset management plans.
So I remember during a budget cycle, and this was going a few years back, the conversation was split between budgeting for growth and budgeting to take care of what we currently own. And we're talking billions of dollars. And something that stuck out for me was that we didn't know what the life cycle of certain assets were. And you talked about switching away from metallic materials into materials that will certainly have a longer lifespan. But all of this costs money, and it only costs one person money, and that's the ratepayer at the end of the day, whether it's through development charges that are paid one time or whether it's through taxation. Do you have other sources of fundraising at your disposal? And I know this isn't a budget conversation, but conversation with other levels of government to assist with growth in infrastructure when maybe the city hasn't decided on its own to grow, but it's a provincial plan for the city to grow. Is there a way that you tap into colleagues for that type of planning?
So you mentioned development charges. So obviously the goal is to have development charges fund growth to the greatest extent possible. There are some grants available through provincial and federal governments that we're always looking to take advantage of. Right now there's several grants around infrastructure that will enable housing. We do receive what was formerly called federal gas tax funding, which is now called the Canada Community Building Fund. So we do receive a number of sort of either one-time or ongoing grants from other levels of government. And then the other thing I think we'll probably get to talk about a little bit is, you know, the city has the opportunity to levy dedicated funds for infrastructure renewal.
Nicely done. So yeah, it's a lot to think about. It's a lot of different funding envelopes to consider. But as we go forward, and I'd love to sort of dive deeper into some of the projects that you're working on. There is the asset management component, which you said kind of covers buildings, above grade, below grade, and then fleet. Give me an idea of how you separate between sort of the discretionary and the non-discretionary priorities that you have.
Sure. So just some examples of some non-discretionary priorities are water and wastewater. You know, there's lots of regulation around safe drinking water, treatment of sewage, and, you know, whatever effluent we're putting back into the lake. So not a lot of discretion around the things that we need to do there. And, you know, part of the reason that those two areas have their own dedicated funding source that we collect through water and wastewater rates. Lots of other things then are discretionary, but this is an interesting chat that I always have with my team. You know, it would be really great if we could just say, well, water, wastewater, roads, those are the things that are the most important because you kind of have to have them. But no one wants to live in a city that doesn't have parks. No one wants to live in a place that doesn't provide these great rec facilities and other things and trees. So the balance between the discretionary and non-discretionary is not quite as simple as you would think.
I can imagine that, and I also imagine that you have conversations with the members of council who are the ones that are sort of frontline speaking with your members of the public. You also have other opportunities to speak with members of the public and get that feedback. We'll touch back on that when we come back from the break. But when we do come back, I'd love to get in a little bit more detail with you, sort of what do we own as a city, and break that down a little bit and explore how that can actually really consume a huge amount of your time, your attention, your focus to ensure that we have that quality of life in this city. So stay with us for more from Kelly Oakley, who is the Associate Director of Corporate Asset Management with the City of Barrie. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Barrie City on the Move, and I've got phenomenal Kelly Oakley from the City of Barrie's Corporate and Asset Management team, department, and we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about the assets, we're talking about renewal, but also growth. What we haven't really talked about, it sounds so far like it's a one-person team, and that's not fair to the team of people that you've got working with you. A lot of engineering, it sounds like, but tell me, who makes up your team and what are some of the specialties that they enjoy undertaking on a daily basis?
So a lot of folks on my team are engineers or engineering technologists. We have an accountant on our team, and then we work actually really closely with other departments. So we work, you know, in collaboration with the whole finance department. We work in collaboration with the teams in our corporate facilities and even in our operations branches and our design and construction teams across the city, because really asset management covers the planning for an asset all the way through its construction, its operations and maintenance, all the way to disposal and replacement. So the whole spectrum of an asset's life. So we work with people all across the city.
Actuaries?
We don't have any on my team.
Okay.
There might be some in our finance department.
Okay. So the reason I ask is, as you're speaking, I'm listening to you and I'm thinking to myself, this is actually a prime example of planning for the installation or the growth, and then actually deploying it and building it, laying the ground, and then maintaining it. But pretty much as soon as it's in the ground, it seems like the takeaway that we've learned from yesterday, so to speak, is plan for its maintenance, its lifespan, its end of useful life cycle, for example, and almost immediately plan for its eventual replacement, even though it might be well beyond your tenure with the city.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. So that's really where the accountant comes in, depreciating the asset.
Yep.
and okay.
Yeah, and that long-term budgeting piece again, right? Like being prepared for the future and understanding what you need to have in the bank in the future.
Yeah. The other thing that I really heard was, I mean, there is such a stereotype, and I'm throwing it out there. You don't have to say it. I'm going to say it. That there is a probably a well-earned stereotype in government in general or in larger bureaucracies that one hand didn't know what the other hand was doing. But you've been through a transition with the city that actually has essentially, I'm going to say, put that to rest with the amount of collaboration that goes on interdepartmentally and interagency-wise. Give me a little bit of an idea of how you've worked to dispel and ensure that we're not at that deficit of a lack of communication.
So one really great example is, we keep talking a little bit about really understanding what we own. And when I joined the city, we didn't have a great understanding of everything that we owned. But who does is the folks in operations that are looking after it every day. So one way that we gather information is to have our operations folks out there with their, as they're doing work on assets, they're gathering information about it at the same time, all going back into a central asset repository that we can then draw on for the future. So that's just one way. Other teams across the city, obviously, when our design and construction team are planning to design something that we've planned for, they're working with the operations group to find out anything that they need to know so that it can be operated and maintained well into the future.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know how much of this you know off the top of your head, and I will absolutely give you a pass. But in terms of the amount of kilometers of infrastructure that we have, whether it's just road surfaces themselves or the pipes below ground, we're talking thousands and thousands of kilometers, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. So this is a big number, which is sort of, I'm not sure if it actually puts it in perspective because it's such a big number, but the city owns between 11 and 12 billion dollars worth of assets. So to replace everything tomorrow, if we had to, 11 to 12 billion dollars. Some of those asset classes are smaller. We've got around 600 pieces of fleet and equipment with a replacement value of about 80 million. Our biggest asset class, I think it's wastewater, and it's well over $2 billion, and that's the treatment plant plus hundreds of kilometers of sewers. I think our number of roads is about 1,600 lane kilometers of roads.
Mm-hmm. And when people are thinking about their property tax rate or it going up, I mean, there are some things, again, non-discretionary versus discretionary, that our ratepayers are at the mercy of, whether it's inflation, cost of labor, cost of replacement materials, et cetera. COVID didn't help. Interest rates didn't help. Cost of fuel didn't help. And again, this may or may not be your department, but so much of the city's expenditure could be petroleum-based when we're talking about asphalt and when we're talking about the fuels to run our equipment, et cetera. But getting into the actual assets themselves, you talked about one of the biggest ones being water and wastewater. There is a cost of living beside a beautiful body of water, a beautiful freshwater body of water. We actually drink from this water and we have to protect this water, and we're obligated, I believe, even under legislation, for some environmental protection regarding the drinking water source, et cetera. That does have an impact compared to some neighboring municipalities that aren't drawing water like we are from the Bay. Talk to me about sort of some of the added precautions or elements that your department has to sort of keep an eye on to ensure safe water drinking. And that may be through partnership, obviously, with the people who are the operators of.
Right. Our infrastructure department contains both our water operations branch and our wastewater operations branch. And the city is subject to the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan, as a number of municipalities around the lake are. But it certainly adds a layer of complexity as our wastewater operators are looking at the effluent, there's a major project underway at our wastewater treatment plant to improve the quality of wastewater treatment so that the effluent is not impacting the lake or not increasing any impact that we would have on the lake, even as the city grows.
Mm-hmm. So speaking, there's the element of being good stewards of the environment, and part of that includes being proactive. And you made a comment which I thought was noteworthy, and it actually made me smile. There are a number of projects that you've seen that the city undertakes that could cost lots of money that you hope you never actually have to make use of. Talk to me about some of those projects.
Right. I think the biggest example of that is probably some of our flood mitigation projects, right? So, climate change is actually changing the way that storms present, and they're becoming more frequent, and they're becoming more severe. And what that means is a lot of our major storm sewers and big culverts need to be upsized to prevent overtopping of roads, to prevent flooding, like we've seen in a number of areas, particularly in the downtown and around the lake, historically. So, it's expensive to put those projects in place. And I guess what we hope is that when the big storm comes, that those projects and that infrastructure then absorbs the flooding, the majority of the flooding, and the residents aren't aware and they're not impacted by flooding of roads. And either that, I suppose we could hope that the storm doesn't come, but I'm not sure that's likely. It will likely come one day, and then we hope that the residents don't see all of the negative impacts that it could potentially have brought otherwise.
During my stay on council, I did participate as a board member of not only the county, but also the Nottawasaga Conservation Authority. And one of the things that I learned that was absolutely fascinating, the conversation has shifted away from whether it's global warming or not global warming to climate change. And what we've noted is that what used to be the 20-year storm is now happening annually. And you see people who built in floodplains who now no longer are able to enjoy, and all you have to do is look south of the border just very recently, what happened there with some storm activities. There are a number of people who have suffered some significant casualties. But I do remember in not so distant past, the Lakeshore Drive, it would flood, and you'd have some standing water in there, and cars would. Now, a huge amount of money was spent when they redid the Lakeshore Drive itself and the parkland, et cetera, but it is not a coincidence that we're not seeing standing water and we're not seeing flooding. So just to dispel any rumors around whether or not climate change actually is real, we have some real, well-documented examples of how we have to and have had to sort of change our idea around engineering technology to work with changing climate conditions.
And you would have noticed, people might have noticed that in some areas we've, where the creeks are outletting to the lake, rather than have them contained within a culvert, they're now sort of open channels, which can accommodate rises in the water and a little more of that sort of storm burst more easily.
Excellent. So what are some of the other things? We talk about facilities management. We've got some buildings in the portfolio. We've got City Hall, obviously. We have a number of libraries. We've got a number of recreation centers and facilities. We've got a police and emergency services campus, fire halls. In terms of asset management there, are you planning as well for their eventual replacement and renewal, or what does that involve other than general upkeep?
For sure. So my team isn't responsible for the operations and maintenance or the specific planning on the facilities. So sort of shout out to the corporate facilities team who are doing that work. But my team definitely works with them to ensure that we're gathering all of the information that they know about what it costs to operate and maintain facilities, what components of those facilities are really critical to the facility operation and would impact the level of service we're providing, and then communicating that to council. So for example, we know there's a number of facilities in the city that are in pretty poor condition, and we need to make some investments in them, and so my team works with the facilities team who have all of the information and the knowledge, right? It's their area of expertise, and we help them pull that information together, and then it just becomes one more data point that we share with council when we're doing, budget work or making decisions around where to invest.
What would traditionally be the average life cycle or lifespan of a building?
It's really tricky because the envelope of a building could be, in the range of 80 years, but a lot of the components of a building are much shorter lived in terms of sort of like 10, 15 years, right, for some of the HVAC components or, facility roofs. So it's really an interesting subject because it's not like a pipe where a pipe is sort of a standalone thing, from an engineering infrastructure perspective that lasts maybe 80 years. The building has all these complex systems that interact together.
Mm-hmm. So as I'm hearing you speak, and I'm actually picturing a number of the projects that are happening around the city right now. For example, one of the bigger projects that you can't miss it is the building of the new transit facility over at Allendale, for example, and the goal to sort of move some of the services from the downtown core to Allendale. As buildings are reaching their end of life, or there is the end of life of the actual physical asset, but there's also the way a city is evolving and the needs of the people. How is that planning being considered in terms of user experience and the patterns of ridership, or the patterns of the way people are using the services within the city to sort of guide and direct your next project?
Those would certainly be things that are the expertise of the folks in transit and the folks in facilities, as well as all of their partners. But I would say that the focus for all of them really is, again, on the assets only exist to provide service. And so an asset can fail, to your point, because it's old and it's reached the end of its physical life. It can fail because it is too small and doesn't have the capacity anymore, or it can fail because its function is no longer delivering what the public expects or what council would like to see that service be, how it would be delivered. So a couple of different ways that assets can fail, and we're always sort of, keeping our hands on all of those things.
Mm-hmm. So when we come back from the break, what I'd like to dive into with you is the cost of being reactive versus the cost of being proactive, and maybe some examples that you can share with us. I'm sure that there are people who, sort of shake their head and at the convenience or the lack thereof when certain normal things or lives are disrupted. But I basically want to give you an opportunity to make the case for proactivity, so I'm letting the cat out of the bag. But when we come back from break, Kelly Oakley, who's the Associate Director of Corporate Asset Management, will take us on a bit of a tour of some of the projects, and we'll talk more about making a case for proactive versus reactive. So stay with us. We'll be right back. This is Barrie, a city constantly evolving. At any time, a whole host of pressures challenge the intricate tapestry of city government. In this series, we will explore the priorities deemed essential for progress, even if they don't always inspire unanimous applause. Join me each week for a candid conversation with a member of our city government, as we uncover the stories behind the scenes of Barrie, a city on the move. Welcome back to Barrie City on the Move, and we're talking about asset management within the city of Barrie. And Kelly, this is a fascinating conversation for some, I'm sure, and for me included. And really, I want to get into you with the whole concept of proactive versus reactive management, and how, really, as you said during the break, it's the most responsible way of spending your money. Talk to me about how you decide, where those priorities are and what opportunities you have to be proactive around really extending the life of those assets and getting the most out of them.
So that's really a great way of saying it. So one of the goals of asset management is to minimize the total cost of ownership of an asset, so over its whole life. And one of the things that we do, a great example is with our pavement management program. So if you can get to a road and you can fix the surface layer of asphalt while it's in fair condition before it slips to what we would call poor condition, you can really save some money, you can reduce disruption to the community, and you can extend the life of that road and really reduce the total cost over that asset's life. We often talk about our resurfacing program, our pavement management program, as a way to help people understand. It's sort of like changing the oil in your car, right? So you do these planned, proactive activities throughout the life of your car, and that prevents you from having a transmission failure or major engine problems, right? So that's one of the analogies that we use, again, when we're talking about pavement. If you can keep the surface cracks to a minimum, you can keep that nice, smooth surface. Not only are you providing a good level of service for the public, but you're also preventing cracks that water could get into, and that's really where, when water gets into pavement, you get that freeze, thaw, heave cycle, that assets like roads start to fail. And conversely, if you don't do anything to your roads while they're in that sort of mid-range of their condition, then they start to really deteriorate, and you start to see them deteriorate really quickly. Then the only way to save them is to fully reconstruct, which costs a lot more. It's not as good for the environment, and it's more disruptive to the community. It takes a lot longer. Instead of getting in and out in a couple of weeks, you start to see those larger construction projects that take a lot longer.
Now, I've got to be fair, and I want to minimize the amount of fan mail that I get regarding this topic, but you did touch the nerve. It's roads, and obviously roads are one of those items that certainly are a favorite conversation starter in any municipality. And I would argue with anybody, if you think the roads in Barrie are bad, you haven't been to Montreal, you haven't been to Toronto, you haven't been to some other municipalities. Nobody's sort of immune to this, and you touched on something that I think is quite relevant, and that is really the freeze-thaw cycle, or the climate cycles that we do go through, the seasonal cycles that we go through that really wreak havoc on our pavement. But there are those who will say, are you kidding me? We've got some roads, first of all, we've got tons of construction, so nobody's happy about the fact we've got tons of construction. Or on the flip side, we've got roads that seem like they've been in a really lousy state of repair for a number of years. How are you prioritizing that in terms of which roads? You see the CAA puts out its annual list of sort of worst roads in the country or the province. Are any of these a surprise to you?
It's not a surprise. Every 4 or 5 years, we do a condition assessment of our entire road network. And so we typically know which roads are in very good, which are in very poor, and everything in between. Right now, the city, we measure pavement condition using an index called the Pavement Condition Index, or PCI. The city's average pavement condition index is around 71, which is considered good. Notwithstanding that, they're still in the range of, I think, 18% of the city's roads that are in poor or very poor condition. We're not discounting that something needs to be done to those roads. One thing that could be holding us back from doing something is that there's actually infrastructure below the ground that needs work as well. So it's not just replacing the surface asphalt, but perhaps there's no storm sewer, perhaps the sanitary sewer or the water main are in poor condition, perhaps that road needs to be widened, and so a much larger investment is actually required. And in those cases, some of those roads may end up staying in poor condition for a little bit longer while we ramp up the investment for that whole big reconstruction project.
So I think two prime examples of that, tell me if I'm wrong or if I'm warm, would be Bayview between Little and Big Bay Point, as well as Duckworth Street. Are those a couple of good examples?
Those are both two great examples where there were subsurface needs, so whether it's storm sewers, sanitary water mains, and also there was a need to do a little bit of widening, maybe add a lane, add some active transportation infrastructure like bike lanes and sidewalks. And so unfortunately,
it's funny that we rattle some of these off, but that takes the price point from 1 to about 3 or 4 times that amount. So
100%, yeah. The cost of a full reconstruction, not just the road, but all of that subsurface infrastructure is incredible.
So if you're going to resurface a road, it's one thing, but if you're going to add sidewalks, if you're going to do culvert replacement, or if you're going to do the below grade, take me through a little bit of an understanding, or take the audience really through a little bit of understanding of the difference between just resurfacing a road and actually digging the whole thing up and redoing it. I mean, there's planning and there's environmental assessments, et cetera. What's the difference?
So one of the biggest things, to your point, is planning. So utility understanding where there's third-party utilities as well, right? So there's gas and hydro and telecommunications, and so understanding where those are, they may need to be moved. We may need to purchase property to actually widen a road. There's a lot more. I mean, certainly even just the road resurfacing, if we're just looking at that top layer and sort of making it black again, for sure it also involves engineering. There's a geotechnical investigation, and we have a design team that does all the engineering. But the more extensive projects definitely just require, several years of planning and engineering before we even get to the point where we can do the construction.
Now, some of these projects actually are in proximity. We have the blessing of being bisected by the 400 highway, and a number of these projects, if you've been paying attention, we've seen, Essa Road, we saw Harvey Road, we've seen Duckworth, we're about to see Bayfield, if I'm not mistaken, the Ann Street Bridge. So in proximity to all of these sort of provincially prioritized projects, there's the impact and the spillover that it has into the municipality. What does that collaboration look like? And again, would we see some projects delayed because we know on the horizon there's going to be a provincial project happening? Potentially
there's delays or even advancements of some projects if we can get ahead, but the collaboration piece is really key, right? So coordinating the city's needs. For example, Essa Road is being widened at the same time as the province is widening Highway 400 and reconstructing their interchange. So there's some mutual benefit. And then other times, there are projects by the county or projects by developers that the city needs to plan and coordinate our projects around. We don't want to, I know the public struggles when there's a lot of construction in prime construction season, lots of roads are subject to detours and lane closures, but really it's an ongoing effort with lots of moving pieces to try to ensure that we best schedule those projects to minimize the impacts to the traveling public wherever possible, and we thank them for their patience during those stressful times.
Would you say that you can actually quantify what the savings is of being proactive?
On the pavement side, getting back to sort of earlier in our conversation, we estimate that it's actually 8 times more expensive to let a road fail than to be proactive and do that, like I said, that partial resurfacing on a regular basis.
Now, there are some things that bewilder some people, myself included. You see a perfectly good road, and then you see this crew out there, and they're taking this saw and they're cutting lines in it, and it seems like there's sort of aimless lines that are winding through, and then they pour this black stuff on top of it. What's that all about?
That's our crack sealing program, and it's, again, really interesting because your perspective is common. There was nothing wrong with that road, is what we often hear, and it didn't probably look like it to the naked eye, but there were cracks forming, and there's a minimum crack. We wouldn't create cracks just for the sake of filling them, but we have some really great analysis of where it makes sense to fill those cracks again. It stops the water from getting in, it stops the freeze thaw impacts, and it can prolong the life of a road. And you typically see crack sealing on a road that's not very old, and you might do that 1 or 2 times, and then you would get to the point where it's time to just take off that surface layer and put on a new layer of asphalt.
And so separate from that, we also were talking about what's happening below grade, and there's some proactive process that's been undertaken, and you mentioned sort of off the top of the show, we've actually changed the material that we use below grade to have a better life cycle, to not rust and really degrade over time as quickly. And there's a word that there's a bet going on in the back room that I'm not going to be able to say the word cathodic, but then now I figured out how to say the word cathodic, but now I forgot the rest of the name of the program. So tell me about this cathodic process that you use below grade.
So cathodic protection is a method of extending the lives of metallic water mains. So water mains were traditionally built out of cast iron or ductile iron, and we generally don't use those materials here in Ontario anymore. But they can be really vulnerable to corrosion in certain soil types. So it's a whole chemical process. If you attach a sacrificial anode to the water main, the soil will start to corrode the anode as opposed to the water main itself. And only certain water mains in the city, obviously the metallic ones, are sort of eligible for that program. And we've just spent, I think, over the last 10 years or so, we've cathodically protected most of the metallic water mains that were good candidates.
Right.
Sometimes they're just too old and there's not really a point anymore. But sort of that sweet spot of the water mains that it made sense to do cathodic protection on, we've just wrapped that program up.
Well, for anybody who is a fan of boating or fishing, for example, and you've got an outboard motor, actually I know on the bottom side you've got one of these little cathodes, and it's that sacrificial anode that you're talking about does the same thing. So fantastic. I appreciate all of that. When we come back from the break, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about planning for the future. You talked about growing towards 2050 for about 300,000 people, and we'll touch on some master plans that you've got underway, some engagement, and really a call to action as well for public participation. So when we come back from the break, tag you're it. You've got a role to play. It's your city. It's our tax dollars at work. And so we're going to cover really how you can participate in the planning and contributing your priorities to the city of Barrie. So stay with us for more from Kelly right after this break. Welcome back to Barrie City on the Move, and Kelly Oakley, who is the Associate Director of Corporate Asset Management at the City of Barrie, and I are having a conversation around really that asset management. And we've talked about how to prolong the life, preserve the life of these assets, get the most out of them, be fiscally responsible with them, minimize where possible the inconvenience to ratepayers, but at the same time make sure that we're being good stewards of those assets and the environment. And now let's get into, Kelly, planning for the future. You've already teased us a couple of times that we're planning. Somebody says we're going to have 300,000 people in this municipality by 2050. That is a massive number that needs to be planned for. We need to take care of the assets and the infrastructure that we do have, and we also need to design and build and implement and plan for that future growth. That is a massive, massive undertaking. One of the ways that you do that, though, is through engagement and through the development of what's referred to as master plans. Talk to me about, first of all, give me a bit of a high level on what these master plans are. What is the master plan? What is that process? And then sort of what can the public expect and where can they participate in really the say of the growth of our community?
Sure. So the city is planned to grow to just under 300,000 people by 2051, so hit the numbers. And our development services team has recently had an official plan approved, which lays out all of the different land uses and where certain things are going to be in terms of development for residential and employment lands and things. Once that work is finished, it sort of moves over to my team where we do our infrastructure master plans, to your point. So right now the city has master plans underway for water, wastewater, and transportation. And essentially it's an engineering exercise largely. We look at all of the infrastructure in those areas, water, wastewater, transportation, that currently exists. And then we have electronic computerized models of that infrastructure. Then we build on them with scenarios for the future population. So knowing where the specific population pockets are going to be, we can understand where we need to extend sewers, where we might need to add bike lanes or widen roads. We can understand if and when we will need to upgrade the size of our water or wastewater treatment facilities, and put together basically a long-term plan for what that infrastructure is, approximately when it'll be required, and then of course what it will cost.
So something tells me that you're not the first person doing this. This has been done by other municipalities. We're not reinventing the wheel. Is there a case study or scenario that you typically refer to? Is there something that actually during your tenure here at the City of Barrie that kind of caught you off guard, that you remember, I remember that day when we learned something that we weren't prepared for when it came to planning or asset management? And how do you really sort of best prepare for these eventualities?
I can't think of an aha moment, but certainly the city itself has done master plans a number of times. So before the new growth numbers were released by the province to 2051, we had done a set of master plans back in 2019. They were looking to 2041. Before that, we did master plans after the city grew and expanded our boundaries back in 2010. So you're right, it's a pretty common exercise for municipalities to undertake. And it's usually triggered by a new horizon, so whether it be a move for planning from 41 to 51 or a new set of population and employment numbers that we're aiming for is typically what triggers it. The process, again, starts as an engineering exercise. And then, of course, we have conversations with council, and then we also engage the public to find out what their concerns are with our existing levels of service and what they would like to see into the future as well.
Mm-hmm. So communication is key, and the public does have an opportunity to participate. We'll get into that in just a moment. Something on the horizon for me, though, is a couple of potentially, I don't want to say competing interests, but things that caught my attention. We've heard in the news, we've read in the paper, the City of Barrie in discussion with neighboring communities about potential annexation or potential growth beyond our, sort of borders as they are today. But then at the same, in order to prepare for that growth, and at the same time, we're also hearing that federally, the government is re-looking at immigration numbers and potentially dialing back some of those numbers from whether it's 1 million down to 500,000 down to 350,000 now is the latest number that I heard. How does that impact you, and what opportunities do you have to sort of adjust as we see these forecasts change or the conversations continue? Because nobody's got it perfectly figured out is what I'm hearing.
Sure. It's that we have some flexibility. The master plans take a couple of years to develop. So once you have sort of your base assumptions around growth projections, it is a bit tricky to be too terribly nimble and react. So we sort of have to draw a line in the sand and say, these are the assumptions that we're working with, this is our current boundary, this is the horizon, and this is the population number we're looking at. But to your point, it's a moving target. I mean, if we were always chasing our tail to try to hit the latest, we would never get anything done. I think the really important thing about master plans is that they are a guide. They aren't written in stone. We don't expect that the projects that we identify will absolutely be built according to this very strict schedule and timeline, because we need to adapt. We have partners in this, which is the development community, and it's difficult for us to predict exactly when their development will go and this road needs to be widened without engaging with them, right? So there's this ongoing discussion about how do we anticipate the growth and have the infrastructure there, but not have it there so early that it's not being used because the development isn't following behind. And it's a bit of give and take, and so that's what I mean by the plans aren't necessarily carved in stone, right? It's an idea and it's a plan, and we're less likely to adjust the forecasts within the master plans, to your points about changing immigration levels and those kinds of things, and more likely to just adjust when we implement the plan. Advance projects, defer projects, change the scope of some projects as needed as we get there.
Gotcha. And again, trends and habits, the population trends, consumer trends, buying habits, et cetera, are probably part of the analysis that you're looking at. If we're going to go to 300,000 people, there is a question around the type of built form that we're going to be seeing built. So who are you working with and who are you consulting with in terms of looking at density? I imagine if you're going to be laying infrastructure, you're going to be laying the appropriate infrastructure to meet the density targets and I don't know how you do that, but I am curious of how that conversation goes.
Sure. So I think you've hosted Michelle Banfield from our development services team, and they are obviously, again, lead our efforts on the official planning, the zoning bylaw, and things like densities are fundamental to as output from the official plan and input to our master plans. That's what allows us to do, the complex calculations around how many people, how much sewage will they generate, how many people, how much safe drinking water will they consume, right? And so there's all of these factors that we take and apply to those population targets and densities that feed into the engineering models and ultimately determine how big a water main needs to be or how wide a road needs to be, for example.
So for people at home who are interested in the future of their city and they want to be engaged, they're either watching council, whether it's on YouTube or on cable, or maybe they're sitting in the audience, but they want to be informed. They have an opportunity to get on a mailing list and sort of receive updates, but there are other ways to engage. And you've got some of these master plans that you're talking about, these sessions going on. Tell the community how they can get involved and learn about what you're up to.
So I would suggest that anybody who wants to learn about the master plans go to buildingbarrie.ca. That's the city's engagement platform online. And there are pages for each of the water, wastewater, and transportation master plans, some high-level schedule information, and that's where we will certainly be sharing on a regular basis the updates of like when the different engagement activities are happening. You can sign up there for a mailing list for any of the master plans. Upcoming on November 14th is actually a public information center, the first one for our transportation master plan. And it's being held at the Peggy Hill Team Community Center in the evening. I think it's 5 till 7:30 p.m. And really that's the first PIC, Public Information Center, is an opportunity for the public to share their concerns, what they like about our existing transportation network, what they'd like to see more of, what they'd like to see less of, how they'd like it to be changed to suit their lives better. There are ways to participate without attending the Public Information Center in person if you can't make it out that evening, and those are all listed on buildingbarrie.ca as well.
Perfect. So for those who aren't familiar, new to the area, the Peggy Hill Team Recreation Center is on Mapleton, just near Essa Road. Formerly known as the Holly Rec Center, if I'm not mistaken, as well. But that's happening on the evening of the 14th, so that's a way to come out. Buildingbarrie.ca, and then also get on the mailing list, the email list. So there are lots of ways to participate. The city also is undertaking, I believe, some budgetary surveys, so ways for you to get involved there and express your interest. So I just want to take a moment and say, thank you so much for bringing a human element to the work that you do around asset management and planning, and really talks to both the collaboration but also the fiscal due diligence that's being done with our tax dollars. So Kelly, Oakley, thank you so much to you and your team for taking time to join me and give our audience some insight. So really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And we will see you next time on Barrie City on the Move. Take care.